Sarah McLinn was just 17. Daniel Blake was 52. One was a quiet teenager with a haunted past, the other, a respected community man with a dark secret. When their lives collided behind the closed doors of a suburban home, what followed would unravel into one of the most chilling and controversial murder cases in Kansas history. This is the story of control, manipulation, and the brutal revenge that turned a victim into a killer. Sarah McLinn was the kind of teenager most people overlooked. 17 years old, quiet and withdrawn, she moved through the halls of her high school like a shadow. Her grades were average, her attendance spotty, and she rarely spoke unless a teacher called on her. Other students didn't bully her, but they didn't befriend her either. She was the type of girl who blended into the background, unnoticed and unremarkable, just the way she seemed to want it. What no one could see was that Sarah was living a double life, one filled with silence, fear, and secrets that stretched back years. After her parents' bitter divorce, Sarah's mother left the state, unable or unwilling to take her daughter with her. The custody agreement gave temporary guardianship to Daniel Blake, a 52-year-old man who had once been a close friend of the family. At the time, no one questioned the arrangement. Daniel was respected in the community. He ran a successful landscaping business, attended church regularly, and volunteered at the local community center. He had no criminal record, no history of violence. He seemed, at least on paper, like a stable figure who could provide for Sarah when her life had fallen apart. From the outside, their living arrangement looked generous, almost admirable. Daniel gave Sarah a room in his spacious suburban home. He provided her with clothes, food, and a car to get to school. Neighbors would often see them grocery shopping together or working in the garden on weekends. He spoke proudly of her accomplishments, and she nodded politely during these public appearances. No one saw anything alarming. If anything, people viewed Daniel as a man doing a good deed for a struggling teen. But behind the closed doors of that house, a very different story was unfolding. Daniel's kindness had come with conditions, unspoken at first, then enforced with increasing intensity. Sarah wasn't allowed to have friends over. Her phone was monitored. She had to report where she was going and with whom, down to the minute. Over time, the restrictions tightened. Her social media was deleted. Her contact with teachers and classmates became minimal. What began as concern for her well-being quickly morphed into total control over her life. Sarah never told anyone what was happening. She didn't cry out for help or attempt to run away. She followed the rules, did her chores, and went to school with the same blank expression every day. But inside, she was unraveling. Daniel's control extended beyond just physical boundaries. It seeped into her mind. He told her that no one would believe her if she spoke out. He said her mother didn't want her and that she had nowhere else to go. Over time, Sarah began to believe it. She started to think that this life, this prison, was all she deserved. Still, a part of her held on to something. A quiet anger started to grow. A small buried part of her began to fight back, not with words or rebellion, but with thoughts. She began to observe him closely, to study his routines, to count the ways he controlled her, and in the silence of her room she started to plan. By late 2013, Sarah McLinn had spent over a year living under the thumb of Daniel Blake. The cheerful facade he wore in public had long since dropped behind closed doors, revealing a man who saw control as love and fear as loyalty. His behavior had grown more erratic and invasive. He tracked her every move, demanded to know who she spoke with at school, and even began calling the high school office pretending to be her father to monitor her attendance and behavior. The house, once a place of supposed safety, had become a cage built out of psychological warfare. Daniel made Sarah feel like she was nothing without him. He told her she was lucky to have a roof over her head. He reminded her often that no one else cared about her. Whenever she tried to assert herself, even in small ways like asking to visit the library alone, he would turn cold, sometimes going days without speaking to her. Other times he would explode in anger over minor things, slamming doors or smashing plates to assert dominance without leaving visible bruises. He understood how to manipulate the boundaries of the law. He didn't need fists, He used isolation, guilt, and fear. Sarah's world had grown smaller and darker. At school, teachers noticed her falling grades, but chalked it up to typical teen apathy. She began skipping classes, sometimes staying in the bathroom for entire periods just to avoid people. She wore oversized hoodies and rarely spoke unless forced to. Her eyes always seemed tired, like she hadn't slept properly in weeks. In reality, she hadn't. The stress of constantly being watched, judged, and controlled left her mentally and physically exhausted. Despite the weight of her fear, something had begun to shift inside her. The thought that she had no future, that this was all life would ever be, began to feel unbearable. What terrified her more than Daniel's rage was the idea of spending the rest of her life trapped in it. That fear slowly began to fuel a different kind of energy, desperation mixed with clarity. She started looking for ways out. She researched emancipation laws online. She wrote a letter to a counselor at school, then tore it up before turning it in. Every option felt like a dead end. He had made sure of that. It was during one of their many tense dinners that Sarah realized Daniel had grown careless. He'd had a few drinks, as he often did, and left his phone unlocked on the counter. She glanced through his messages, not because she wanted to spy, but because she needed something, anything, to help her understand the man who held her hostage. What she found wasn't just controlling behavior. It was evidence of his manipulation extending beyond her, messages to women, half-lies, and veiled threats. It confirmed what she had suspected all along. He was dangerous. In the days that followed, Sarah's demeanor shifted again, but this time with intention. She acted more obedient, more compliant. She didn't argue or protest his rules. She played the part he wanted. But inside, she was making a decision. She began to mentally prepare for what she saw as the only escape left. Sarah no longer saw the situation as survivable. The only way to be free, she believed, was to end it. Not by running, not by pleading, but by stopping Daniel permanently. January 17, 2014, began like most other days in the Blake household. Quiet, uncomfortable, and tightly controlled. Daniel had spent much of the afternoon in his usual chair, sipping from a tumbler of whiskey and watching television. Sarah moved around the house on autopilot, cleaning the kitchen, folding laundry, and making dinner. She had rehearsed every moment of that day in her mind over and over. Nothing would be left to chance. She had chosen the date carefully. It was a Friday, which meant there would be less suspicion if she went missing for a few days over the weekend. The timing also gave her a small window to escape before anyone might realize something was wrong. Daniel had no close friends who would check in on him regularly, and his business had slowed during the winter months. Sarah hoped that would buy her time. That evening, she kept her voice soft and her movements precise. When Daniel complimented the dinner she had made, she forced a polite smile. Her heart pounded, but her face showed nothing. After dinner, she cleared the dishes and waited. She knew Daniel's routine well. After eating, he would drink until he passed out in his recliner or stumble into bed. On this night, it was the latter. By 11 p.m., he was asleep, snoring loudly in the darkened bedroom. That was her moment. Sarah walked to the bathroom, opened the drawer beneath the sink, and retrieved a knife she had hidden beneath a stack of towels 2 days earlier. It was a kitchen knife she had taken and cleaned thoroughly. She wrapped the handle in a thin cloth to avoid leaving prints and walked slowly to the bedroom. Every step felt like it took an eternity. When she reached the doorway, she hesitated for only a second. Daniel lay on his back, unaware of what was coming. In a single motion, she crossed the room and began the attack. The force of the first stab startled even her. She didn't stop. The fear that had held her hostage for so long turned into something else entirely: adrenaline, fury, survival. She stabbed him over and over, releasing every ounce of pain and fear she had buried for years. When it was done, the room was silent except for her heavy breathing. Daniel lay still, covered in blood. She had slit his throat last, a final act that severed him from her life in every possible way. She dropped the knife on the nightstand and stood over him for several moments. Then, as if snapping back to reality, she moved quickly. She cleaned herself off in the bathroom, changing into fresh clothes. She grabbed her backpack, which she had packed in secret the night before and took his car keys from the hook near the door. Before leaving, she checked the house one last time to make sure nothing would immediately link her to the crime. She wiped down door handles and turned off the lights. Then, without a word, Sarah walked out of the house, started Daniel's car, and drove away into the cold Kansas night. She had no clear destination, only a single goal: disappear before anyone discovered what she had done. Sarah drove through the night with no plan, no map, and no clear idea of where she was going. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel, her mind racing through what had just happened. She kept waiting for a wave of guilt or panic to hit her, but it never fully came. Instead, there was a strange stillness inside her, as if her body and mind had gone numb. The further she got from Kansas, the more real her escape began to feel. She wasn't running from a man anymore. She was running from a murder. She stopped only when she absolutely had to, at gas stations in small towns where no one asked questions. She paid in cash using money she had taken from Daniel's safe. Her appearance was plain, and no one gave her a second glance. She avoided eye contact, kept her hood up, and spoke as little as possible. She slept in the car during the day, driving mostly at night to avoid police and curious eyes. For nearly a week, she drifted from one rural highway to the next, heading south with no destination in mind except distance. Meanwhile, back in Lawrence, Daniel Blake's neighbors had started to worry. It was unusual for him to go so long without being seen. When a co-worker reported him missing after days of unanswered calls, police were sent to his home for a welfare check. The moment they stepped inside, they were met with the unmistakable smell of blood. The crime scene was brutal. Daniel's body lay in his bed covered in stab wounds, his throat cut deeply. The scene showed no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, and no robbery. But one thing was missing: Sarah McLinn. Her sudden disappearance immediately placed her at the center of the investigation. The missing teenager became a fugitive overnight. Her name and photo were broadcast across the country. Tips poured in from people who thought they had seen her, but none were confirmed. The media latched onto the story. A quiet teenage girl, on the run after killing a respected local businessman. The public was divided. Some saw her as a monster, others as a victim pushed too far. The break in the case came nearly a week later, when a routine patrol officer in Everglades City, Florida, spotted a car matching the description of Daniel Blake's missing vehicle. Inside, parked near a boat ramp, was Sarah McLinn. She didn't run. She didn't lie. When officers approached her, she calmly gave her name and surrendered without resistance. Back in Kansas, detectives were stunned by her demeanor. During questioning, Sarah confessed without hesitation. She gave precise details of the murder, the abuse, and her escape. She described Daniel's control over her life, the manipulation, and the threats. Her voice didn't waver. What stood out most to investigators was how prepared she seemed, how calculated her plan had been, yet how emotionally distant she was from the horror of what she had done. Her confession changed everything. The case was no longer just a murder, it was now a disturbing window into the life of a teenager who had lived under constant psychological pressure and made a choice that shocked an entire community. As Sarah McLinn sat in a Kansas courtroom, she looked vastly different from the girl the public had come to know from news headlines. Gone were the baggy hoodies and withdrawn expression. Dressed in a plain prison uniform, her face was expressionless, eyes forward, as the details of her life and crime were laid bare before a judge and jury. The courtroom was packed with reporters, spectators, and supporters from both sides, those who saw Sarah as a murderer and those who believed she had simply done what she needed to survive. The prosecution wasted no time presenting their argument. They framed the killing of Daniel Blake as cold, premeditated, and violent beyond necessity. The number of stab wounds, the precision of the attack, and her calm departure from the scene all, in their view, pointed to intent. They highlighted her flight from the state, the efforts she made to cover her tracks, and her confession as evidence that this was not a heat-of-the-moment crime. To the state, Sarah was not a desperate teenager, but a calculated killer who made a conscious choice to take a life. The defense painted a very different picture. They brought forward psychologists, trauma experts and social workers who had evaluated Sarah in the months following her arrest. They described her as a young woman who had been subjected to long-term emotional, psychological, and likely sexual abuse. According to their testimony, Sarah had experienced grooming, subtle but deliberate manipulation that stripped her of her sense of agency and left her feeling powerless. The defense argued that the murder was not planned in malice, but born from a place of terror and exhaustion. Her only perceived escape was through violence. Photos of the crime scene were shown to the jury alongside excerpts from Sarah's journals, which had been recovered from the house. In them, she wrote about feeling invisible, broken and afraid. She wrote about wanting to disappear, to run away, to scream, but always concluded that no one would listen. These entries, according to the defense, illustrated a mental state of someone pushed far beyond her emotional limits, but the prosecution held firm. They argued that while Sarah's circumstances may have been tragic, they did not excuse her actions. There had been other ways out, they said. School counselors, the police, shelters. Killing Daniel, they claimed, was not an act of self-defense, but revenge. After days of emotional testimony, the jury deliberated. The community waited anxiously for the verdict. In the end, Sarah McLinn was found guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. The ruling sparked national debate. Some called it justice served. Others believed it was a failure of the system to recognize the complexities of abuse victims who act out violently. In interviews years later, jurors admitted the case haunted them. Sarah had not fit the mold of a typical criminal, and Daniel Blake had not fit the mold of a typical victim. Now serving her sentence in a Kansas correctional facility, Sarah remains largely silent. She does not grant interviews, and she receives few visitors. Her story continues to stir emotions across the country, a reminder of how pain, silence, and control can lead even the most unassuming individuals to shocking ends.